Good morning. Welcome to Coffee with Doc here on Tuesday, November the 2nd. And I'm glad you joined us here today. We're talking about the truth about you, the truth that God says in His Word about you. And today and this week, we're looking at the truth about your purpose. In other words, why did God leave us here if all of those things we said about the truth about our salvation, if all of those things are true, why didn't God just take us on to glory at that moment? And the reason is that He has a purpose for each one of us. Each one of us has a special purpose for us to fulfill. So we're going to look at that this week. We introduced it yesterday morning. Hope you were able to join us. If not, you can go back and get a hold of that if you're a little bit confused about what we're looking at. But He has a purpose for us. And Romans 8, verse 28, He says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him and who've been called according to His purpose. So He's working out His purpose in you. And that's the first thing we want to look at this morning, is that God has called you and God has called me according to His purpose, as we read in verse 28. Now, here's the thing we need to understand about that. First of all, His purpose in our life is progressive. Now, what do you mean, Dick, by His purpose is progressive? What I mean is this. His purpose is not something that happens overnight. Now, just because you've accomplished something good in the name of the Lord does not mean He's going to call you to heaven the next day, because He is working out His purpose in us, and His purpose is progressive. Let me back up in chapter 8 to Romans 11, and let me read that to you. Romans 8, verse 11, excuse me. All right, I'm going to back up to verse 10. But if Christ is in you, there it is. Christ is in you, accomplishing God's purpose through the Spirit. And he says in verse 11, and if the Spirit, there's the Holy Spirit, if the Spirit of Him, there's God the Father, if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, that's the indwelling Holy Spirit that we've already talked about. And if the Spirit of Him who raised Jesus from the dead is living in you, then He who raised Christ from the dead, that's God the Father working His purpose out through the Holy Spirit, raising Christ from the dead, He who raised Christ from the dead will also give life to your mortal bodies because of His Spirit who lives in you. So he says His Spirit is living in you, and He's giving life to our mortal bodies in order that He may progressively, every day of our lives that we live out our life, we will be living our life according to His purpose. Throughout our lives, He is progressively bringing us to His ultimate purpose. And in our mortal bodies, He does that throughout our lives. Now, can I tell you an easier way to remember that? We are a work in progress. I remember the old thing that we used to say with the Congress on youth, or the youth congresses, and all of those kind of things. That say, please be patient with me. God is not finished yet. And I've remembered that for all of these years. And I'm reminded of that every time I look in a mirror. Please be patient with me. God is not finished yet. In other words, we are a work in progress. So His purpose in our life is progressive. Every day He's doing something in our life to bring about His purpose. Now, that's the first thing we need to remember about His purpose. The second thing we need to remember about His purpose is His purpose is good. Now, that doesn't mean that everything that happens in our life is good, because that's what He says here. He says, we know that in all things God works for good to those who love him. Doesn't say that everything that happens is good. He says we know that in all things God works for the good. Now that means his purpose is good. And sometimes there may be some discipline that's needed in our life that comes through hard times. And so his purpose is good, even if the feelings we have are not good. And that brings me to the third thing, is that not only is his purpose progressive, it happens every day in our lives, a little more and a little more. We're a work in progress. His purpose is good, even though it may not be good when it happens. And his purpose, and here's something that's the hardest for us to understand, his purpose for our life may mean suffering. Well, Dick, I didn't want you to bring that up because, man, the one thing I hate is suffering. Well, I'm glad you brought that up. Let me back up to verse 18 of Romans chapter 8, and let me read just verse 18, where Paul said, I consider that our present sufferings. Now, wait a minute. Remember, Paul's the guy in prison. Paul's the guy who's been in prison just for loving Jesus. Paul's the guy who was beaten and left for dead. Paul is the guy who's got run out of different cities. Paul is the one who knows what it is to suffer. And he said, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Ooh, that's the glory that's exactly what he was saying, what I said a while ago. We are a work in progress. Be patient. God is not through. He's not finished with me yet. And his purpose in my life may mean suffering. And you think, I just don't know why I have to suffer. Can I answer a question for you? If you're watching this in the United States of America, I know everybody everywhere is fussing about all of the problems that we're undergoing as a nation because of the election and the politicians and the political scene and the culture and everything else. Can I tell you something? You think you're suffering now? You had the privilege of being born in the United States or coming to the United States. And while we may go through suffering as a nation, we're not suffering like many of our brothers and sisters are in other nations, and where they have been suffering for centuries in other nations. You don't know how good we've got it. Work as hard as you can to change the circumstances and the situation. That's why God allowed you to be born in a free country. Work to keep it free. But stop complaining about irritations that you think are suffering. Now, I know if you're going through some kind of health issue, that's suffering. If you're going through broken relationships, I know that's suffering. But we need to quit whining about our suffering and ask God to do in us what he wants to through our suffering. Because this fourth thing is true of his purpose. When we've been called according to his purpose, his ultimate purpose is to make us look like Jesus. We are called to be made into the image of Christ. Back to what we were reading a while ago, verse 29. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image or the likeness of his Son. In other words, he is conforming us to the image of Christ. That's why the sufferings, that's why the irritations, that's why everything. I jokingly refer to Barbara, my wife, as my heavenly sandpaper. And I'm reminded of the sculptor who was asked one time when he was about to take a huge block of granite and sculpt it into a horse. And somebody asked him, said, how are you going to go about doing that? And he said, do you see this chisel? He said, yeah. He said, do you see this hammer? He said, yeah. He said, I'm going to take this chisel, I'm going to take this hammer, and I'm going to walk up to that block of granite, and I'm going to knock off everything that doesn't look like a horse. Did you know that's what God is doing in your life every day? He is knocking away the things that don't look like Jesus Christ. And sometimes he'll use a chisel and a hammer, and it hurts. Sometimes he'll just use something abrasive, a small irritant, kind of like sandpaper, and he'll knock away the things that still don't look like Jesus. So whether it's suffering with a blow of a hammer and chisel to your soul, or whether it's just a minor irritation, he is working in your life. And sometimes he uses Barbara in my life as my heavenly sandpaper. I bet all of you have got some heavenly sandpaper in your life too. Let God do his work through it so that you may be conformed to the image of Christ. That's part of his purpose for your life. Now, tomorrow we're going to look at something more about this. So God bless you. Have a good day, and we'll see you in the morning.